going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and seeing as Saints mandatory minicamp starts today, I thought it would be a good time to maybe finally break down Saints OTAs, a new experience for me and something I almost somewhat turned into a unicorn joke on this show, saying that I'm going to keep bringing it up, but for simple scheduling purposes, it just really hasn't worked out. Granted that OTAs are on Tuesdays, the show comes out on Tuesdays. That's really dictated my last 3 weeks. I had Ross Jackson on to break those down, and that conversation went everywhere but on the field and really to do with the X's and O's of the game of football. But I have been attending every Tuesday. I've been taking my notes. I've been doing a couple radio show breakdowns, but wanted to just kind of do a recap on things I've noticed, what I was kind of looking for going into this year, how things look very different. A lot of that to do with quarterback. I was already getting into my next point, where I'm kind of just going to dig into the bread and butter of the secondary, what I saw last season. I think a lot of missing context in the issues that plagued that position group, a lot of injuries, which always seems obvious. But when I really went through the lineups last year, it stuck out to me how little time that starting group in the secondary actually got together. And looking at the lineups that OTAs provided, what I really want to see out of the secondary heading into this week of minicamp. Now, this show will keep evolving quite honestly, just the way that my brain works and the way that the season is scheduled. Given that we're in the dead of the off season, I can have a little bit more creativity. But again, I've talked about going to the scouting academy and attending OTAs, which, just to get the terminology out of the way, that stands for organized team activities. I'm going to keep saying OTAs because, quite honestly, I keep forgetting that. And my instinct starts saying off-season team activities, which it's not actually. But heading into the season, I think this will get a little more streamlined. But I've been enjoying sharing my personal experiences with you guys, and those have seemed to resonate pretty strongly. Yeah, there's been some more emotional, heavier episodes, and quite frankly, there's just not much emotion going on in this one. But just to kind of recap what it was like going to what was two new experiences for me, because it wasn't just OTAs, it was also rookie minicamp. Those are two new experiences for me. And if you had watched my episode with Ross Jackson, we had kind of talked about, and I really liked how he phrased it, because I really hadn't thought about it this way myself, where I think, yeah, I agree with him, where if I had gone in and, sorry, my chair gets stuck under here at times. If I had gone in my first year and everything was thrown at me at once, training camp, these OTAs, I almost said off-season team activities, rookie mini camp, going into press conferences, covering games, they're all such different skill sets I've learned, and ones that it really helps and is valuable to kind of sit back and experience and learn from other people. We had talked about how that plays into asking questions, and that's something that I admittedly still struggle with. And as I talked about, it's really kind of that issue where I almost have too much access, not in a bad way with Tulane, but it's different when you work for a team rather than with a team. And yes, I'm employed by a radio network, but I'm used to being basically able to ask pretty much any question with almost the idea of it all being off record unless explicitly otherwise said so. That's completely different than what you're looking at when you're in a press conference room covering the Saints. So I'm still kind of in that sit back and wait mode. It's something I'm fairly comfortable with. As I've said, I'm an only child, and I grew up being very observant. My dad would take me to the park to get me to socialize with kids, and I would just kind of climb a tree and sit up there because I like to just kind of sit back and observe. And that worked really well for me heading into these jobs with no experience in them, because I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with just standing there, not really knowing what's going on. And for some reason, that's something that doesn't really bother me whatsoever. So I've just kind of been sitting back and soaking this all in. And just going back to what I took away from rookie minicamp was how intriguing rookie prospect Jake Haener was at quarterback. And admittedly, he's kind of become less of an emphasis point just because of Derek Carr's presence, which is something I'll get to in a second. But those building blocks, I remember last year that the talk of rookie minicamp was Alontae Taylor. And he's someone that I've been very high on since last year. I remember, draft night, the reaction being just a little confused. Granted, all that New Orleans gave up in capital that entire offseason heading into that draft, And I think a lot of unfair emphasis got placed on Alontae Taylor's importance. Granted that after he was picked 49th overall in the second round, they didn't pick again until round 5. And so I think it was kind of, okay, we got these 2 positions of need at wide receiver and left tackle with Penning and Olave, but what are they doing with Alontae Taylor? As I'll get to in my third segment, it turns out that he was probably so unexpectedly crucial in that draft class, but seeing kind of those pieces start all the way back at this time, it puts a lot of perspective into what I walked into during training camp, and quite frankly, how much I think I would have missed if I hadn't been able to attend these. I think back to my first season of training camp being with Sean Payton and a quarterback competition. And then the second season, it's Dennis Allen, and now it's Jameis Winston starting, but Andy Dalton's in the building. And now this year, there's some consistency at head coach, but there's a new quarterback again. And seeing guys like Michael Thomas come out, those little things, seeing who doesn't attend the voluntary sessions, and very curious to see who will be there today, and seeing what they do with the lineup in the meantime. But I think if I had walked into training camp, I would have felt this different air with Derek Carr, but I would have missed the building blocks of seeing how immediately he had chemistry with receivers and what position groups actually look stronger than I thought. And that's all a very new experience for me. Again, one I'm very used to on the Tulane aspect, but put a lot of perspective for me into what context is really necessary and valuable heading into now minicamp and training camp, which is coming up a lot sooner than I thought. As I've said several times on this show, it's really about context, and every bit of information that you can get about a team, I just think offers so much more value. And just to kind of expand on what I think, again, I would have missed out on. And I think a lot of that goes back to quarterback. And just to kind of go through those last couple of seasons again, granted that I'm talking about them from a training camp perspective, and that's, again, something that's coming up pretty soon, but I've seen just so much turnover at this point that I think I've almost been conditioned to a sense of chaos in the building for the Saints. So again, yeah, my first season covering the Saints going to training camp was the last season that Sean Payton was head coach. And I watched a very uninspiring quarterback competition, to say the least, where I don't think anyone honestly really enjoyed covering that. And I still stand by the fact that there really was no winner there, because if it takes until the second preseason game, man, New Orleans allergies just will not let up this year. If it takes until that long to have someone separate from the pack, and when you just look at the fact that my argument that whole offseason was, it's not like I'm necessarily promoting Taysom Hill. My notion was more, if this is a situation where it's an even race, to me, on premise alone, Taysom Hill is winning, because he shouldn't even be in this conversation in the first place. That's not to knock Jameis Winston. I don't think that any real care has been placed into a quarterback under center for the Saints really since Drew Brees retired. And it's because replacing a franchise quarterback is easier said than done. I think the Saints could have just stuck with what they were doing. They didn't even have to have a quarterback competition. They could have just said, Jameis Winston's a starting quarterback, Taysom Hill is not a starting quarterback, so we're going to roll with it that way. And you technically would have gotten the same results, but I think we saw how difficult that task can be, but that's just because someone has the resume or the traits, I guess, being a former number 1 overall pick, playing in the NFL with real starting experience, having an offense tailored around you, having actual on the field snaps at quarterback, not spending half your time in a bunch of different rooms. You think about Taysom Hill's first couple of years on the Saints, he went to every meeting room, including special teams. He's blocked a punt before and done work there. And when you're taking away from your craft, and just to make it personal, that's why I've had some rough off seasons in the past, because, I could have gotten a part-time job, but I've wanted to learn the scouting academy. I've wanted to learn my craft, and that would have taken away from that. So just thinking about, again, how much cerebral ability is needed at that role of quarterback, I think it was just a losing battle from the get-go. And then think about the context last year where they swung and missed for Deshaun Watson, and it was a pretty big swing. And yes, they brought back Jameis Winston, but then he got injured, and I don't know if we'll ever know the full answer. I don't really care at this point, to be honest with you. But yeah, Andy Dalton becomes a starter. Neither of those were very good seasons of football to analyze. I think there's a little more creative game planning going on in Sean Payton's final year, but just immediately there's been this air of authority and comfortability. And I think that all ties back to Derek Carr at quarterback. And I'll admit, I hadn't really had time this offseason to really look at him. The Tulane season lasted a lot longer than expected, getting that New Year's Six berth. And then we started spring camp very uncharacteristically early. And so I was in the middle of that. We were about 2 or 3 weeks ahead of most colleges. And then the Saints signed Derek Carr. And I just really hadn't had the time to look into him. Admittedly, I was not jumping for joy, but what else kind of was the options there? They don't have a top pick. I'm not really sure that they're in a position of developing a rookie quarterback right this moment. That's again why Jake Haener, and I think that developmental ability with him, having an actual legitimate quarterback room is so important and something they can really pay attention to now. But even if they got a Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, there's a lot going on there where Derek Carr just looks like a seasoned pro out there. And just hearing him speak, he's not. I remember this quote that Drew Brees had told Jameis Winston when he took over the reins. And it was something along the lines of, you don't have to be Batman all the time. In other words, you don't really have to always be the hero. And it seems like that's kind of how Derek Carr is, where he really doesn't want to come in and be seen as this hero type guy. And it is big shoes to step into because let's be honest, he's really stepping into Drew Brees' shoes. But what stuck out the most to me was Michael Thomas's presence at OTAs and just the immediate chemistry he seems to have with Derek Carr. And yeah, let's be honest here. Teams, there's a PR purpose. Cameras were out when Michael Thomas came out there, but I don't also blame them. It's not a bad thing. I think a lot of people have just a fundamental misunderstanding of PR, but that is a completely different conversation for another day. What I found more valuable than seeing him on the field was actually hearing him speak and how he spoke about his mental recovery from injury, which is something I really want to delve into on a further episode, and his comments about Derek Carr. He talked about how he was working on things like his hands this offseason when he had issues with this ankle and lower body. A lot of guys can get stuck in that very draining and just seems like pointless at times physical therapy. I remember it took me months to be able to walk for 2 minutes on the treadmill, and that was supposed to be an exciting jump for me. I was so restless at that point, and I'm not a professional athlete. So I can only imagine just that itch. And you think about someone like Klay Thompson too in the NBA, when you are a younger star and you just have a season after season where you have year-long injuries. The fact that he said that he spent time working on his weaknesses and his weak points, that stuck out to me a lot because that takes a lot of mental fortitude to get past not just your mental recovery from the actual injury yourself, but okay, if I'm limited on this right now, what else can I be working on either from a mental or physical perspective? And immediately I'll say what stuck out on the field, even though he wasn't participating in 7-on-7 drills, was the fluidity of his hips. It looks like he's really worked on strengthening. I'm someone that has been called out for having weak hips by a running store, and I'm a little insulted by that, even though they were dead on, but it's a muscle that a lot of people have to work on, and something especially that lower body injuries can affect. Remember when I got a really bad high ankle sprain, similar to one of Michael Thomas's injuries, and they told me that I was developing bursitis in my hip, which is inflammatory because of the way that I was walking. And I could just tell that he had put a lot of care, I think, into that flexibility, and you could just see it in his cuts in that short, limited time. But he gets right up there and immediately compares Derek Carr to Drew Brees. And I think that's going to be something that Carr is probably not going to want to have happen and can't really avoid, just because that's what happens when you step into shoes like that. But Michael Thomas does not strike me as the type of guy that just says that about anyone. And it's not the way that he's spoken about anyone since Drew has left. And you just think about how personal and emotional when Drew Brees retired, Michael Thomas's kind of goodbye statement to him was. It surprised me a little how highly he seemed to value him. But just hearing, again, how he described Derek Carr's command in the huddle, that he does the little things, that he's disciplined and he makes everyone around him be more disciplined. And then you hear Derek Carr just kind of one-off saying things about sending Michael Thomas clips that he saw from this point during the season. And I'm just kind of laughing, thinking in my head, a lot of guys would find that annoying. And he's probably really preaching to the choir there, Michael Thomas, where they're just both such hard workers. Then you also hear him just, again, in these little one-off comments to Juwan Johnson, where even if he threw him a completion, he takes the time afterwards to go over to him, talk that over, and see if there's adjustments he can make to make their job easier. And heading into this year's draft, there were a lot of holes on this roster. And wide receiver, even though they invested so much capital and really got it paid off in Olave, the starting lineup last year was Landry, Thomas, Olave. That was the intended one. And then Olave was the one who saw the field the most. Landry was on IR, Thomas was on IR, and now Jarvis Landry is gone. Michael Thomas is supposed to be good to start training camp, but it can't all be, on one receiver again. That being said, I think Derek Carr really has elevated that group and the tight end group immensely. Foster Moreau also immensely elevated that tight end group. He just has that pedigree that I think the Saints have really been missing there. And I think you can get away with the Juwan Johnson type conversions if you have someone that legitimizes the role. And unfortunately, I think, with Adam Trotman and that, there just wasn't enough of a threat as a pass catcher. And you think about Travis Kelce, think about Jimmy Graham and how absolutely dominating and demoralizing he was to defenses. That's something that I think the Saints have been missing. Yeah, they miss a lot of blocking from their tight ends, but just not a reliable guy for short area gains. Foster Moreau is immediately that guy. But Juwan Johnson has also looked really fantastic. That and the fact that there's been a lot of short passes to Jamal Williams and working in the running back into the passing game. That's something that was really missing last season. And the usage of Alvin Kamara really didn't make much sense. And so it's interesting in OTAs because you're not getting the exact starting lineup. I'll get into the secondary in a second because that one I think is really still a big question mark with some of the guys that didn't attend, but you see a lot, I think, in who steps into those roles and what you get out of them. And the fact that Jamal Williams is not the exact same archetype as Alvin Kamara. I think he's a little more versatile and less of an immediate downhill runner than you think of Mark Ingram, although Mark Ingram could receive. I just think he was at the end of his career. But the fact that he has been used so much, especially in the last day of OTAs, which was a lot of goal line, red zone type plays, seeing who was kind of the first option, I think illuminated a lot. A lot of the time that was Jamal Williams. The consistency at O-line is going to probably be, the end all be all of this year. And looking at last year's lineups, that was something that really was not very consistent, especially on the left side of the ball. But I also think when you have a quarterback that can get the ball out quicker, that can offer that O-line more help in setting protections, making checks at the line of scrimmage, and all of the conversations surrounding Carr from head coach Dennis Allen, how Carr has described his conversation with Pete Carmichael, all of that indicates that he's more than ready to be able to do that. And so if he's already shown the ability to lead these position groups and really take individualized personal care to each one, that's something that's really been missing at that role. And just this command and control, for him to have only been in the building for this short of a time, I just think that it all comes down to his communication, his emphasis of really wanting to be on the same page and speak the same language as all of his receivers. At first, I took that to mean the offensive system, the cadence, all of the terminology that the Saints use. I've really learned that that's actually a personalized process that Carr has shown in his comments and through these couple of sessions of OTAs to take that time one-on-one. And I think that's going to be a difference maker. Now I want to get into the bread and butter, which is the secondary for me. Again, it's the position that I completed first in the scouting academy, defensive back, going through the intricacies required and the distinction of what a box safety versus a free safety, strong or free, I guess, what that looks like, how that differentiates at slot cornerback, and then what you need out of, your true cover corners. So I just have all that knowledge, but then I also feel like I can visualize that role better because it's the way that I could compare my playing days in soccer best to. It's probably playing that strong safety role, if I'm being honest, or in that center back role in a flat four, kind of that philosophical switch that we saw the Saints move to last year. There's quite a bit of turnover in the secondary, which I think got a lot of flack last year for just so much injury turnover and the fact that all levels of the defense were having issues at one point or the other. whether it be injury or just the fact that things haven't worked out, especially at the defensive line, the lack of pressure that they were able to get last year, leading them to play less conservative, or I'm sorry, more conservative in their coverage, less aggressive in their coverage, but then trying to do so with a bunch of moving parts that weren't actually the starting vision in that secondary at all. You can only expect so much out of those guys. I remember when they signed Marcus May and Justin Evans last offseason. I looked at their tape and I remember not knowing what exactly to take away from Marcus May. He looked strong on paper, but the play going on in the Jets defense just was not great. And you could tell that there was a lack of communication, and that affected everything on plays that lasted also, frankly, way too long. And you can only expect so much out of your secondary in those moments. It's unfortunately something we saw a lot happen to the Saints last year too, where there's only so many seconds that you can expect a cornerback to remain in phase with the receiver before this is something that's going on at a different level of the defense. But then you also think about, again, changing from that idea of having a strong safety in Malcolm Jenkins and a really defined free safety in Marcus Williams under Sean Payton. What are the strengths and weaknesses of that? If one of those guys got injured, I think it's a lot harder to replace those exact skill sets, but you've also lost then very specialized skill sets, I think, in both Jenkins and especially Marcus Williams. I think what you saw a lot of that loss last year was what he was able to do in the passing game, his range, his ball tracking ability, and his ball skills, the ability to make interceptions, deflect passes. It made teams attack the Saints defense differently. It made the dink and dunk short gains and running game be more of an emphasis. And at the time, I think that was something that the Saints defense also had a better strength in being able to stop the run. And everything just kind of bled out last year. But when you look at what was that lineup at training camp, then they lost CJ Gardner-Johnson at that slot role. And it's not just something you could put another secondary player in and say, okay, well, why don't you go play slot now? I think a lot of guys can play cornerback, safety better than they can just slotting into that role, for lack of a better term, because it is such an intricate, defined skill set, one that you could really see the value in CJ Gardner-Johnson. And then the vision that I had kind of foresaw at that role were players that ended up having to play completely different positions last year, because that starting tandem of Marshawn Lattimore, Paulson Adebo at cornerback, Bradley Roby at the slot, Matthew and May at safety never actually started a game or played together one time last year. You had Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu for 10 games last year. You only had Lattimore and Adebo on the field together for 3 games. That's tough. Adebo didn't start the season because he was hurt. And then when Adebo got back into the lineup, then they lost Marcus May. And then they lost Marshawn Lattimore very quickly thereafter. They went through a really rough stretch where PJ Williams played safety, Justin Evans played safety, but then Paulson Adebo got hurt. And so you had Alontae Taylor starting opposite Bradley Roby. And then week 7 happens against the Cardinals, where everything just kind of blew up, where Paulson Adebo was out, Marshawn Lattimore was out. Alontae Taylor, who had not been activated since he came in mid-game when Marshawn Lattimore was ejected against the Buccaneers in week 2 and played very well at that when he did come in, he went immediately on IR right after that. And so his first real game start was being a starting cornerback opposite Bradley Roby. And then Bradley Roby gets carted off and is on IR for a few weeks after that, starting in week 8. And then you have Chris Harris Jr. coming in, who I believe also got hurt. That game was just quite frankly a mess. But I think it really showed just how many struggles there were going on there. By the time that they finally got Marshawn Lattimore back, wasn't until week 17. By that point, you had also again lost Marcus May to injury, and Daniel Sorensen finished out the season opposite Tyrann Mathieu. It's just not what you want to have going on there. So for all of the versatility and all the promise I think we saw in training camp last year, the fact that that lineup never actually made it on the field together really sticks out to me, because it was already a stretch when they lost CJ Gardner-Johnson, having to account for that in their current personnel group. I had some ideas, but again, those players became necessary at other roles. So coming into this season, you'd only see so much during OTAs. Unfortunately, Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo did not participate, but you saw a lot of Alontae Taylor playing the slot in spite of that, even in first team rep situations with Bradley Roby out there. Saw him play cornerback opposite Roby quite a bit as well. But it makes me very curious, because to me, he's just simply too impressive and talented to leave off the field. he was one of the players I had hypothesized alongside Justin Evans, with Bradley Roby being kind of the obvious example to take over for Gardner Johnson last offseason. So while I think you can make the case that Taylor can play both cornerback and nickel, you can't really make that same argument in what we've seen from Paulson Adebo. The games that he's struggled in have been when he's had to play a little less off coverage and have a little less of that space to eat up. Whereas the games that Alontae Taylor excelled at cornerback were when he was really being a shutdown press cover corner against DeAndre Hopkins, and then Devontae Adams immediately the week after that against, ironically, Derek Carr and the Raiders. It sticks out again that he played wide receiver. And I think those traits really translate to why I saw him and those traits at that slot role. You have to have really good reactionary athleticism. You have to have short area quickness right off the line of scrimmage. And then all of those moving parts in space, you're in a very condensed area. That's something I also think his experience playing quarterback in high school also plays a role into as well, because I saw his peripheral vision and scanning abilities when he was playing several different roles last year, but it really values when you play at the slot. And you think about how much teams really trot out 3 receivers and require you to have a credible slot cornerback. Because while Chris Harris was not the answer last year, he was the answer 5 or so years ago when he really revolutionized what it means to play slot cornerback. But again, the fact that he was playing as a starter for several weeks last year is just not a good time, because you really cannot have an aging guy there. You can get away with it a lot more at safety than you can with someone in the slot. But I just quickly kind of looked at the numbers, how often teams ran out either 12 or 21 personnel last year, which basically means that there are 3 guys out there that are either running backs or tight ends, and leaves you with just 2 wide receivers. A lot of the time that tight end will go to the slot, and something that I think Alontae Taylor has shown the ability to do as well, because why on draft night, while I was so intrigued by him, was I wondered if maybe he could play safety, because at the time that was a position of need. They hadn't signed Tyrann Mathieu yet. But even if they had, I still would have felt the same way. But I remember looking at his college tape, again, brain blank. There's my one per episode. Let's hope that's the last one. And I just remember some of these hits he made where he just looked like a box safety, and it really actually took me aback. I remember one where he just quite literally shoved another player over to get to the running back coming out of the backfield, but he also came downhill, and you could see his read of that play was almost more impressive than his downfield tackling ability. But if he's going to be covering tight ends in the slot, that's going to be a necessary skill set. But when I looked back, there's something like a combined 8,000 to 10,000 snaps across the NFL in either 12 or 21 personnel, then over 23,000 snaps in 11 personnel, which means three wide receivers out there. And if you have 3 guys out there that can credibly cover, then you've put yourself in a really good position. So just thinking about what actually happened last year, all of the context of barely having Marshawn Lattimore, not having Pete Werner for a lot of the season as well. And granted, they run out often just those 2 linebacker sets in that nickel coverage role. A lot of that was just really gone last year. Unfortunately, you could only see so much again with what we saw in OTAs, but that's something I'm really going to be looking at going into minicamp is who's playing the slot, because that is still a question mark. But I almost feel like the secondary needed a year, and that would have been the case even if they played together last season, because you just can't have 2 guys that come from 2 different teams as free agents come into a role where they're expected to be complementary kind of tandem safeties in Mathieu and May. And you get veterans for those roles for a reason, because they show the ability to do that, but you barely got them on the field with your starting cornerbacks. And then everything just kind of falls to the wayside there. And so I'll be curious to see how that communication looks. Who is really kind of stepping up there? Who's making those kind of calls? How people come into their own? What it looks like with Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo out there, because you can't ignore Bradley Roby and Alontae Taylor and the amount of time they saw in OTAs, but the amount of playing time they also saw last season as being very crucial, versatile pieces. I think there's an argument that Alontae Taylor makes perhaps a better cornerback than he does a slot corner, but Dennis Allen, whenever asked, just keeps going back to that idea of versatility. And I think he's frankly right, because just when you think about last year, if they were trying to fill way more defined roles, it would have been a lot more difficult. And Chris Richard was somewhat of a defensive back whisperer. Sure. But I think the vision that you saw in Taylor, remembering again that, Paulson Adebo was a Sean Payton draft class guy. He is a lot more defined as a cornerback. You could see Alontae Taylor's versatility, even just in his college tape, especially considering that he started off playing offense and then became the first defensive back freshman to start the season for the Volunteers since 2013, his first year. So he showed the ability to play a lot of different roles at this point, and I really hope to see him in that slot role. But that secondary as a whole is something that I just think needs another season to actually give them a chance to learn how to communicate with who was supposed to be out there in the first place. So just to round this up, what I'll be looking for in minicamp and what I've taken away from OTAs, and through kind of my just recap now on what stuck out to me, is the value of communication and the necessary emphasis that there is for that when you're implementing a system with new players. And you saw that happen on both sides of the ball, to be honest with you. Yes, I've kind of centered in on quarterback and secondary. Just, I know that a lot of the draft capital and a lot of the attention, rightly so, is on the defensive line, which is not really something you get much value out of in those OTA settings. With, even if they have 11 on 11s going, a sack is not actually a sack kind of thing. So there's only so much that you could take away in that aspect. And that's kind of why I focus more on the secondary. It's also just what I'm more familiar with. But really just going through that exercise this afternoon of charting who was playing last year kind of gave me almost a new perspective. I didn't really realize, just injuries are important, I think, both in the player that it happens to, but when you have to take a step back and look at how it affects a system of moving parts. You could see that at a lot of different positions, but I think you really see that play out in the secondary, especially when they were just quite honestly dropping like flies last year. But you've also seen that communication breakdown on the offense last year, because when I talk about, I just kind of ended that sentiment of communication with who's really supposed to be out there. It wasn't really supposed to be Andy Dalton last year. So everyone, I think, suffered from communication with people that ended up not actually being on the field for the majority of the season. And you could already see that a lot of care has been taken to make sure that doesn't happen on either side of the ball. So I'll continue to look at what wide receivers are kind of developing chemistry with Derek Carr, because it's obvious that it's going to be there with Michael Thomas. Said he's going to be good to go for training camp, probably not mini camp. But it also can't just be Chris Olave this season. I also think that Chris Olave has more than enough shown that he doesn't really need to be scrutinized, if that makes sense. Like, I know that he's going to be a reliable, really strong option next year, already showing that last year, stepping into a really tough role with the trio of Landry and Thomas that was envisioned there just not happening. It's really just kind of the theme of, I think, everything that happened to the Saints last year. But there was Rashid Shaheed, the guys that you need a quarterback in order to kind of do, for lack of a better term, those cutesy kind of moves of moving a guy like Juwan Johnson from wide receiver to tight end. You have to have a quarterback that really knows kind of the intricacies and how those passes, how that relationship differentiates. And just, again, Derek Carr's individual emphasis on that with all these guys. But Rashid Shaheed, being an undrafted wide receiver, that's something that the Saints have shown the ability to do quite a bit in the past with guys that are undrafted. But the issue was that they kind of circumstantially became over-reliant on it when they lost a lot of their options. And having Marquez Callaway be wide receiver one in the midst of a quarterback competition after losing Drew Brees is just, I'm very grateful to be analyzing what I'm analyzing now, to say the least. But it's just, again, it's a new experience for me, new building blocks, but it's really put in perspective for me how much context is valuable and to be had in the months of May and June, and how that really tells a story of August heading into the season, thinking about what that was kind of lacking in my context last year, but then also keeping in mind that you have to keep an open mind because nothing is ever guaranteed. Injuries are going to always happen. And to have a team that was able to respond the way the Saints did last year, quite honestly, the way that they ended the season should be kind of more of a positive than anything else. So you got to pray for a little luck and a little bit of health, but you have to have the talent. You have to have the personnel. And I think they were a little thin in both those categories last year, especially at the most important role of quarterback. So that's all for me. I'll be back on Friday with my usual guest format. And please remember to like and subscribe to these episodes, guys. Before the Whistle is available on YouTube in the video format, podcast form, and on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your content. Just remember to click that like button. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I can award more insight after this week of mini camp for the Saints. And then we're off to training camp after that. And I could not wait more to cover that on this show. So with that, I'll see you all on Friday.